He mentions Nasri for his criticism of certain Sufi practices as a representative of the transition from pre-modern reformist ideas to modern ones. However, according to Belqazis, even reformist scholars of the late 19th century were entangled within what Belqazis calls turuqiyya, so the milieu and mentalité of the Sufi brotherhood. So we see that in spite of all the really critical readings in Belqazis, he also very much tries or identifies iṣlāḥ with criticism of turuqiyya. And he also mentions Muhammad bin Ja'far al-Qahtani as someone who was reformist at the same time entangled in turuqiyya. But he lauds him as, I quote, the author of a reformist manifesto, Bayan Salafi, referring to al-Qahtani's Nasihat Ahl al-Islam that he published many, many years later, probably written around 1907-08, and which is also quite well known. So this, for Belqazis, then Nasri and Qahtani are, if you like, representatives of a transitory form of reformism. And what especially characterizes this transitory form in the reading of Belqazis is its defensive character. Belqazis calls it khitab jihadi, but jihad here does not mean like fighting, but rather being on the defensive. So it's not open, according to Belqazis, towards the Middle East, towards European ideas, towards the Nahda. So this is how he uses khitab jihadi. So I translate it as defensive discourse. And you see here that translation is always a form of already engaging with an analytical take. So then, as I have already said, only subsequently Belqazis continuous Moroccan reformism underwent a shift to turn against the traditional culture of the ulama and then to turn to issues of state, society, also being more open to so-called modern concepts. And actually, interestingly, Belqazis also gives a specific example of this inward orientation of early reformist discourse in Morocco. And this example is the role played by what Belqazis calls masadir dakhiliya, so internal sources. So the critical tools would be developed on the basis of traditional genres and concepts from Islamic law. And the example Belqazis gives is the discourse on maqasid al-sharia. Says, so it was so important, and it still remains until today. I mean, even the transnational Arabic philosophical, theoretical debates on maqasid al-sharia very much, are based on Moroccan contributions. So this is an example for Belqazis to say that the inward orientation did not mean that there was no reformist ideas, but rather that the tools or the basis for formulating reformist approaches were internal. So these considerations of Belqazis and also, as I said, the work by Al-Arwi have encouraged me to emphasize the question of contextuality of iṣlāḥ even more. And so I have already described a little bit what I did. So to have a more complex understanding of Nasri and Qahtani, I looked again at their biographies and I looked at different writings by both authors from different periods and tried to make sense of similarities and differences which I encounter. And since I don't want to use too much of the time, so I will skip a part on where I see a lot of similarities, which is their way of, how can I say, the way of presenting most valuable forms of religious authority. So one could, of course, assume that there is a contrast between the faqih, which is the key figure in Nasri, and the salih, which is a key figure in the Kitab Salwat al-Anfas and other writings by Qahtani. But as soon as you go into the texts, you will see that the faqih in Nasri's texts incorporates many of the characteristics of the Salih and vice versa. So I will skip this, just say that there are a lot of similarities. They clearly both draw on their cultural capital of scholarship, and they depend on their mutual recognition. So there was no institution that protected them or gave them titles or anything. So they would depend on also their sparring partners, if you like, to be accepted as part of the scholarly elite. But let me turn to the other topic, which is, or theme that is usually taken as indicating a reformist or a traditionalist position, which is military reform. And here, if we look at, I mean, it was difficult to compare the relevant writings by both authors, because they are quite different in genre, and also they do not come from the same period. And here we really see, I would say, clearly differences, but differences that reflect above all the important time gap between their composition and the changing conditions between, in the case of Nasri, the 1880s and early 1890s, and in Katani's case, the years 1907-8, just really very rebellious and difficult times. So the noticeable urgency evident in Katani's work, and to understand Katani's take on army reform, I studied the Nasihat Ahl al-Islam. It's not just about army reform, but it treats a lot related to this question. So this is a text written in exile and first published probably in 1908. It's difficult even to get clear information. There are different stories also by members of the family that are told about this book. But the first date I could find is 1908. So this work, Nasihat Ahl al-Islam, that appeared in print in Morocco, is due, I would argue, to the imminent threat of the country's occupation by France. So it's not only a theoretical question, but a very practical, with which Katani is confronted. Simultaneously, the text also echoes Morocco's internal fragmentation that was growing, manifesting in protests, in rebellions, in uprisings, and the deposition of Sultan Abdelaziz. So while Nasri, when he wrote about army reform in the late 1880s, he strictly limited himself to arguments based on established legal principles like darura, sadd al-ra'ya, so necessity or averting harm, in order to advocate army reform. So he did not change anything in religious legal arguments. Katani really did something new in that he, if you like, declared army reform along specifically Islamic lines, a collective, perhaps even a national task of an all-encompassing effort of iṣlāḥ. And this is the first time that I find in Moroccan sources really a reference to iṣlāḥ related to administrative and military reform. But if we read Nasihat Ahl al-Islam, we find that while there might be a shift in imagining the Moroccan polity that starts with this text, Katani was openly condemning Middle Eastern experiences of reform because they drew on European models. They invited European experts, and they built on European knowledge. So he completely criticized this. And in a way, one could even say that Nasri's earlier texts, again, which were written around the end of the 1880s, while they were based on traditional arguments, were much more pragmatic. So he was much more open to new forms of military organization. So Katani, in a way, and this is a paradox, he gives much more importance to army reform, but army reform is, in a way, read as a form of iṣlāḥ. So it's not an independent technical development. So what do we take from these kinds of complexities? Let me end by saying that clearly there are no inherently logical programs in one case or the other that would allow to distinguish traditionalist from modernist positions or to distinguish between specific forms of reformism. Rather, and this is something I can only state here, and we wait for perhaps the translation of the book into Arabic for you to see whether you find this convincing. So I read these paradoxical interventions as forms of participating in these ongoing internal negotiations and forms of socially embedded political power that I have mentioned in the beginning with, based on Michel Camus. So still Morocco was, as a polity, dependent on forms of mediated power and of mutual recognition of different groups. And so these texts need to be read in light of these processes and do not lend themselves, I would say, to identify philosophical programs and unchanging, let's say, interpretations of iṣlāḥ in one case or the other. So this might be frustrating, ending on this note, and I think, nevertheless, that I will stop here and take your questions and comments. And please also feel free to refer to the readings that have been distributed. And thank you for your attention.
Merci infiniment, docteur, pour cette conférence. Je crois qu'on peut prendre une pause et après on aura tout le temps pour le débat qui sera coordonné, dirigé par C. Khalil Sghir. تفضلوا.